in most governments, not every single one, but in most governments, someone has to be held accountable to actually propose a budget. And in almost all instances, the executive branch of the government is responsible for preparation of the budget proposal. Okay? So usually the first phase of the budget is preparation of the executive budget. The next phase is usually legislative consideration and approval. Right? So what we're going to be doing in analyzing the budget over the next 5 weeks is kind of very comparable to what happens during legislative review and approval consideration. In fact, you know, the City Council of Chicago has 50 members, right? There are 54 students. It's roughly the same thing. A bunch of people are going to get together and decide whether the executive proposal merits approval, modification, or rejection. Then once the budget is approved, it goes back to the executive to implement. And finally, there is the process, and once the year is over, of financial reconciliation and reporting. Did we do what we were legally required to do? Did we track money in the appropriate sorts of ways? Did we follow the rules related to our funds and sources of money? The GFOA criteria generally are focusing on the uses of the budget. So for example, one of the areas of focus on how good was the budget as a policy document, right? And it's going to talk about, a lot of it will focus on, does it clearly articulate what the mayor or governor's priorities were, right? The executive is trying to achieve something. Did he clearly state it? Can you understand what he's trying to achieve, or he or she, you know, what they've allocated resources to accomplish? Legislative consideration and approval. If I'm going to give you guys 5 to 8 weeks to review 700 pages of information, did I give you sufficient information that you can actually make sense of it, right? So, and not only like you as a member of the city council who gets paid, you know, $100,000+ a year and has staff to evaluate it, how about the person in the neighborhood who wants to know whether the budget was good? So another area that the Government Finance Officers Association looks at is, how good is the budget as a communications device, right? So not only does it articulate the policy objectives and plan of the chief executive, does it give you sufficient information to understand how he or she ended up at those policy choices? Does it provide sufficient backup information for you to reach your own independent conclusion to either agree or disagree with that? So, you know, in kind of using our example of the police academy and Chance the Rapper and the mayor, could you look at the budget, if that was part of the expenditure in the budget, and could you decide who was right? Right? Then budget implementation. So another area of the Government Finance Officers Association analytical framework, it wants to know, how is that budget as a management plan? Is it a document you can pick up, read it, and say, oh, I know what they want to do. They want to make garbage collection more efficient. I know how they're going to do that. I know how I'm going to allocate resources to it. We're going to talk later in the course about the structure of the budget and how a budget is structured can very much impact the usefulness of the budget as a management tool. Anybody ever heard of a line item budget? Anybody know what's a line item budget? What is it? Yeah, it's a bunch of lines for items. Anybody ever read a recipe to cook something? A line item budget is like an ingredient list, right? It tells you you need 2 cups of flour and 3 eggs. It It doesn't tell you how to take 2 cups of flour and 3 eggs and turn it into a cake, right? So how budgets are structured, just because you get a budget that's adopted doesn't mean that you can actually use it to implement anything. So one of the things that the GFOA looks at is how is the budget in being as a tool for managers of the budget, as well as entities that want to hold that government accountable in conveying how it will be implemented, how those spending and revenue-raising choices will be implemented. Actually, the budget that we'll look at, the City of Charlotte's budget, is generally seen as a really effective budget around this idea of management of the budget. So, and what I'm trying to, and then finally, it's a look at the budget as a financial plan. Are they on course, off course? Are they hiding things, or is it clear what the city's financial condition is? So why are you doing this budget analysis project, and why are you using the GFOA criteria? You're trying to get to the point where you could analyze a budget in the type of context, the kind of real-time context and constraint that most people will actually see a budget. And you're trying to also understand that the budget document that's produced, because it is this public document that includes multiple parties, has to serve multiple users throughout the budget's life. Okay? So the plan has some nice figures, but this is an example of one that he provides in the book. That just looks at essentially what you're trying to do in each phase, or what the output is. So the output of preparation is the budget, the mayor's budget or governor's budget proposal. You know, they prepare the budget and then they say, here it is, legislature. I'm going to give it to you, and now you have to decide. Remember when I showed you what was that list of budget documents? I said there was an ordinance, right? What legislatures do is they pass laws. They legally enact things. So the chief executive's proposal is going to get turned into a law, right, in the form of an ordinance, at least at the city level. And then once that happens, then in terms of management, the government is going to take money in, and then it's going to allocate that money for the specific activities of the government. And then at the very end, it's going to have to be able to reconcile and report that it did exactly what it was told to do in the budget document. You know, the kind of interesting thing that is that really most of the budget cycle, most people think of it really as starting at the end of this and the end of this, right? So it doesn't really, most people don't take into account the work that the executive branch goes into to put the budget together, right? They don't just decide one day, we'll have a budget tomorrow. It takes some time to review it. So in the city of Chicago, right, we used to start, and they still do, the budget process of executive preparation really would begin like April. We would start getting proposals back. So we were only, at the end of the first quarter of the new fiscal year, and we were already getting ready for the next fiscal year, right? So you'd start getting information. You'd spend the first quarter just getting the last budget ready to be implemented, and then you'd immediately turn your attention to asking the departments what they wanted to do next year. And you would start maybe in April so that the mayor could propose the budget in September or October. And the legislature would look at it and be done by Christmas time. Most people, and usually the process of executive preparation of the budget, people think of it as a speech that a mayor or a governor or the president gives. So I've got a plan, right, that usually starts the legislative consideration. And that's usually given a good deal of attention in the press. So most people think of it as the budget cycle is when the mayor stands up and proposes he wants a budget, and it's done when the city council adopts it, the mayor's. Right? That really is just from the end of here to the end of here. But really it extends certainly during the entire year of operations, and then even, right? All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about taxes and fees, this burden thing, right? So government isn't just deciding what it's going to do, right? It's deciding how it's going to pay for it and who's going to pay. What it's going to pay for and who's going to pay. Or how it's going to pay for it and who's going to pay. Right? And really, government money is really just broken, it can be subdivided into three categories. Right? Governments collect taxes, governments collect fees, and governments get money from a variety of other places. And we're going to talk about the requirements and upsides and downsides of each. Sorry, let's go back here. Taxes, like I said, are usually the least restrictive in terms of how the money can be used. Right? Taxes are generally associated with a government's authority to carry out its mission. Or general purpose units of government like cities and states that have a lot of things to do, that authority is generally associated with protection or advancement of public health, safety, and welfare. Federal level, we talk about it like provide for the common defense, protect the general welfare, but essentially it's about keeping people safe and healthy and doing things that help to ensure their prosperity. Right? It's hard to know exactly what that means and how to do it, and hard to put a price tag on it. So generally, most taxing authority is associated with providing sufficient resources to the government to achieve its basic mission of advancing public health, safety, and welfare. Okay? Because the mission can be kind of broad and somewhat ambiguous and often not tied to a specific price, thing that can be priced. Taxes are often seen as the best way to pay for it. Taxes, because they have the least amount of strings attached to them and requirements, are often, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes the most politically sensitive sources of money, and often subject to separate constraints. Those constraints can be limitations from the amount that you can actually raise, like a cap on total property taxes, but it could also be in the form of additional public process and approvals associated with the ability to raise the tax, right? So sometimes there will be things like a referendum requirement that says we will let you raise this tax, but only if you have the voters vote on it and they decide whether you get to raise it, right? So extra rules on taxes oftentimes because they're easy to spend once you get them, right? Most flexibility. Fees sometimes have less restrictions on how you raise them, but more restrictions on what you can do with them. So it's kind of, you see kind of a trade-off, right? Taxes you can use for pretty much anything. We're going to restrict how much you can get it, how much you can get, and we're going to make it harder for you to get it. Fees are easier, and people can decide sometimes to pay the fee or not use the service and not pay the fee, so it's easier to raise, but our constraint we're going to place on you is we're going to make it really hard for you to use it for anything else, and we're going to make you prove that you used it for what you set a fee for. And then other revenues, we'll talk about what some of the sources are. So government